Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Or we can get gully, I'll size up your body and put some white chalk around it.
Welcome to the Single Dads of the Midwest, episode 16. I'm joined this episode by the wonderful Wo to talk about industrial design and improv comedy. Wo is currently getting his PhD all the way in the Netherlands, but I'll let him introduce himself and tell us more.
Hey Alex, thanks for having me on. My name is Wo. As you said, I live in the Netherlands, and at this point, I'm about 3 weeks into getting a PhD on some variant of industrial design. The exact specifics of what I'm going to be doing are going to be changing. I'm Should I tell a little bit about my interesting life of traveling and living in two different places?
Yeah, why not? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so the secret is that I'm actually Dutch. So I was born in the Netherlands, but then my family moved to the US, to Seattle specifically, when I was 6. And then I grew up there. So between 6 and 18, I lived in Seattle. And then when I was 18, I moved here to the Netherlands, to the city of Delft, if it can be called a city. It's quite small. To do my bachelor's, stayed here for my master's, and now I'm still here for my PhD. So some part of me likes this city, but there's always other places to explore when there's no pandemic going on, right?
Of course. And so obviously pretty passionate about industrial design if you're getting your PhD for it. And before I start with the questions, I just want to also shout out to Don/Sheldon for putting this together, single-handedly keeping the podcast alive. And he also wrote some questions, which I think are pretty good, which I'll ask you about as well. But I guess we can start with what got you interested in industrial design in general. Like, what aspect or aspects about this was like, oh man, I got to get my PhD in this. This is so cool.
It's a journey that evolved. I think the moment that I realized that I wanted to be an industrial designer before I knew what that meant was the day that I broke an old laptop. I had this Asus laptop that was horrible. It was like clunky and had bits of plastic all over the place. And I took out a DVD because it was, of course, one of these laptops with like a DVD player. Mm-hmm. And when I put it back in, I managed to lift the DVD tray so that the plastic on the outside broke off.
Oh boy.
And so of course I was like 14 and I was freaking out because, I've been entrusted with this laptop and suddenly it was broken. But I was also just really annoyed at the design of the laptop. So I kept thinking to myself, like, there has to be somebody responsible for kind of giving the laptop its shape, for thinking about like how I interact with the laptop. And whoever did that here did a terrible job. Like, I could break this thing and like the ports were in weird places and it was a mess of a laptop. But that was one of the first memories I had of being very like critical of design. The more academic related answer is I actually did my bachelor's in mechanical engineering because I didn't really know that industrial design existed as a field. But while I was doing my bachelor's, I met people from this other faculty because in Delft, the faculties all get a physical building that's kind of separate from each other. So your faculty is both your area of study, but also like a physical building.
Okay.
And the industrial design building is literally connected with like an umbilical cord sky bridge to mechanical engineering. So I made some friends from industrial design, and then I went to go see a lecture to figure out what that even meant. And then very quickly I realized like, oh, when I got upset about the design of this laptop, that was like what people there are learning to not do, right? To not make it so incomprehensible. And then I so during your bachelor's, you get half a year of elective space in the Netherlands. So most of your classes are set, but you got a half a year to do whatever you want or some kind of predefined course sets. And I managed to get myself into the one for industrial design. So I had a half a year kind of trial period to figure out, do I want to do this? And after 2 weeks, I was like, okay, so this is going to be what I do for my master's. Cool. Let's just have fun for the rest of this minor. And ever since then, I've been doing industrial design and having a great time.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, laptop design is super important. What do you think about Macs? Just curious in terms of at least the industrial design aspects.
I think Apple and in general and Mac specifically, there's some things that they do that's a bit weird, but I think they're absolutely beautiful, right? I think Apple is a company that embodies some very positive aspects of design. I mean, some kind of negative things, like I think, I think Apple made a really good move in like 2017 by just saying, okay, we're going to switch to USB-C. So all the ports are USB-C and we're done. Right? I think that's like, on one hand, that's really annoying, right? Because everything you have, nothing is USB-C based. I mean, for me now, everything is USB-C based, but back then nobody had anything to do with USB-C. And a lot of companies now, like a lot of other laptop manufacturers, they'll have one USB-C port, or what's even worse is they'll have one USB-C port and then one USB-C port that's also a Thunderbolt port, which is this horrible thing where it's like Apple just said all 4 ports work the same, done. And I think that's like a genius move because they just have the ability to decide on something and make that change.
Yeah.
Of course, if they make the wrong decision, then everybody suffers. And there's this kind of, I don't know. Personally, I think it's kind of an overblown complaint about dongles. Like, I understand it's annoying, but I don't. What is a dongle but a cable that's slightly more expensive, right? Like, I had a friend who was like, "Oh, I hate that I can't plug my MacBook into my monitor," and it's like, well, you have a HDMI cable. You can just buy an HDMI cable with a USB-C end. It's fine. Like, the port is just kind of different. And of course, the downside to that is there are things where you need like a dongle to actually change protocols or whatever. But I think like a move like that is really nice in a way, because you don't have this weird period where you have like a mix of ports, and you don't have this horrible situation where you have like ports that are physically the same but are used differently, which is just the thing you want to avoid. Plus, I really like being able to charge my laptop from either side. I think that's just kind of nice. And I think Apple in general, like, they put a lot of emphasis on design, and the iPhone is beautiful compared to what came before. I think now Android finally got its stuff together, so there's actual competition. But like, I remember my dad had a Windows mobile phone, which is like the antithesis of a well-designed phone, because they just said, can we take Windows and kind of cram it onto a phone interface, and then you have a stylus so you can hit this tiny little button. I remember he had that when the iPhone came out, and then you look at an iPhone and it's like, oh, that is how a smartphone, like, that's how you interact with it, right? There's icons, everything's nice and big, size for your fingers, everything is defined from a standpoint of being a phone. And I think they do a lot of good stuff like that. I mean, there's pros and cons to every decision, and I think, like, I don't think everything could be Apple, right? I think Apple can exist because there's a Samsung. If we only had iPhones in the world, it would cover. It's not very inclusive design, let's say, right? Like, they have 3 models of iPhone or whatever, more now, but they used to have 1, right? It used to be like, either you like the iPhone or you just do something else with yourself. And I think it's kind of interesting because that only works because there are other people willing to fill niches. So I think the way Apple operates can't be the way every company operates, but I think it is good that we have companies that push design as value, because I think design is valuable. So I think they've definitely, at least in the smartphone space, completely like revolutionized it. I mean, of course, like more than 10 years ago now, but still, I think it's they gave it a really big push.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like it's kind of a not known, but a big thing about Apple is their emphasis on design. But I wanted to hear from someone who's maybe more of an expert, and it seems like I do agree that there's a lot of pros, but I think part of their flexibility in making their decisions comes from the fact that there's still so many Android users and so many users of Windows and other products.
Yeah, I mean that's like one approach, right? Is if you look at a like there's the we'll do everything approach, and then there's the we'll just put something out there and that's super integrated, which is nice. But if you don't love that thing, if that thing doesn't fit with you, we don't really care.
Yeah.
And I think that that's great for making one or two very good products, but yeah, you definitely end up with a lot of gaps, and that's why hopefully the people that are doing the more niche things also include more design. Then yeah,
for sure. And actually, that leads to another question. This actually comes from Don, though it is kind of broad. What separates a good from, or let's say good or great, from an average designer or design?
Designer or design?
I guess it says designer. So from the person aspect.
from the person aspect, oof. I think that's difficult. I mean, I think that so there's this phenomenon in architecture, and architects and designers where we have like a sibling rivalry going on, or at least here at the university, right? We both deal with people in a technology context, right? Like architects are designers for buildings, and we're architects for products. That's kind of, you know, so we kind of snap at each other because we have slightly different ideas, but we do similar things. And I think in architecture, you have this phenomenon of the starchitect, which is a phrase I absolutely hate. But you have these big names that make statement buildings. And I think that in design, we've largely avoided this, which I think is probably a positive, because if you I'm thinking specifically of the I have to look up his name. So the Seattle Public Library building. They got a new building built downtown Seattle. It looks like a weird polygon nightmare. Like it's like a couple of big slices of buildings shifted with those interconnecting nonsense. I don't know. Difficult to describe, and also difficult to deal with. Like, it's a building that looks cool, but is difficult to exist in, or difficult to have a library in. And it's made by Rem Koolhaas, who is a fellow Dutchman. And he's kind of one of these starchitects, right? He like has a name, and he can design a building, and people will get the building because the building is like cool, but it's not really utilitarian, right? It's not like the most workable building. And I think in architecture, because each building is like a big project, you can get away with that, right? You're not, unless you're designing like a suburb, you're probably not going to be designing one building and producing it 300,000 times. But in industrial design, you hopefully are designing one product, right? One iPhone, and producing it millions of times. So I think industrial design is a bit more dampened down. And so we have like a couple famous designers, but I don't think we have anybody who like designs something on their own entirely and says, okay, I'm done. I think a great designer is a designer who works in a team. I think a designer has to work in a team. Like no designer can produce anything on their own unless they produce something kind of small. And even then, if you're talking about actual production, industrial design, I should say, because there's also design as an art form, which is much more one-off and, like artsy. And there you can have like an art project, a single piece, and that's fine. So I think in industrial design, a great designer is a bit more populist, a bit part of a team ready to talk with an engineer to check that something physically works, because designers really love to make things that look cool and are cool for the user, but often drift away from the like engineering reality a little bit. And I think that a great designer has to like do good design, by which I mean they have to like fight for the user. And I think design is all about like putting the user ahead of other considerations, or balancing other considerations with the user. I once had a lecture from a guy from architecture who said, "Oh, designers, you're just going to be making fancy trinkets for people." And I think that that's true. And I think he meant it in like a negative way, but I think it's actually the right way to look at design, right?
Yeah.
You're making at least one version of design. Of course, there's other people doing other things, but in design, you're trying to make an object as useful as possible, to give it as much value as possible. And I think the best example I have for this is, do you know OXO Good Grips?
I do not.
Okay, so there's these, they're a bunch of different things. They're a brand, but OXO, OXO, they make kitchen appliance or kitchen accessories, kitchen tools. And their whole thing is that they are easy to use. So they have really fat rubber handles. They have a little like pinch point where you know you're supposed to hold them. They all have like the same kind of design cues. So they all have the same hole on the bottom, so you know where to hang them up. It's things like their graters have different colors for different fineness of the grating. It's I think if you go to a store and you look at the OXO Good Grip stuff, you know how to use it instinctively, and you can hold on to it for a long time. So I actually got a chance to sit in on some lectures when I was in South Korea from a guy named Dan Formosa, who was one of the designers of OXO Good Grips. And he does this kind of crazy thing where he tests designs by using his left hand, because he's right-handed, and covering it in oil, and then he tries to use the tool.
Interesting.
Which is a really fun way to like kind of put yourself in the frame of a user who, of course, isn't sitting behind a desk, but in a kitchen. So maybe they have to use their offhand. Maybe they just grabbed some oily substance. So it's a really good way of kind of forcing yourself to deal with these circumstances. And they made a can opener. I think it's one of their first. I think the peeler is their first product, but they make a can opener. And that can opener is like beautiful because the mechanism is exactly the same as any other can opener. But when I grabbed my parents' can opener from like the 1970s, the handles are metal and like super thin. So when you grab it to like crunch into the can, your hands hurt. And the little thing you twist to move the can opener around the can is also sharp and small and terrible. So it's like the same object with a little bit more work and a little bit more rubber can be transformed from something that's unfriendly to use to something that's friendly to use. And I think that's a beautiful example of design where you're adding value by changing very little about the product, but making it fit your user a lot better. Because one is designed for, oh, we just knew how to make this and we're done. And the other one is really, they looked at people and they said, okay, people's fingers don't like tiny pieces of metal, so we'll make it nice and round and things like that. So I think that
seems like attention to detail is obviously very important.
Attention to detail is very important, but I think the bigger, more crucial aspect of that for me is taking nearly the same object, but really making it usable. So adding value without, right? Like you could say, oh, why do you care about a manual can opener? You can have an electric one. You can have a laser that cuts the can off. That would be, the most ideal situation, but that requires much more material. So I think design is about with as little material usage as possible, making a product fit the user better.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and of course, design is really like a good designer has empathy for their users. A good designer, and this is really difficult, and I fall into this trap myself, a good designer doesn't design for themselves. And that's very difficult because there's nobody you know better than yourself, right?
Yeah.
There's no viewpoint that you know better than yourself. There's no experience you have better than yourself. But if I'm designing a can opener, maybe my hands are really big and meaty, so they don't mind the little bits of metal because I've got giant hands, and that's fine. And I have really good finger strength, so I can just crank on this thing all day. But then somebody with arthritis is never going to be able to operate your can opener. People are going to hate your can opener because it's tiny and horrible to use and difficult to handle. But because you don't empathize with somebody else, because you don't force yourself to design for, a different part of the population, you end up with a less applicable product.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so I think a really big part about being a good designer is putting the users first, working with other people in your team, and then like really forcing yourself not to design for yourself, because that's a trap I fall into as well. I mean, part of my PhD is going to be making design tools. And as a designer, I use design tools. So I'm kind of making things for myself. And I know that I'm going to need to like break that cycle. And of course, there's other aspects, talent, skill, putting in effort. But I think those are the main things, right? That separates a okay designer from a great designer is that.
Nice. No, that it's obviously a pretty broad question, but everything you said makes perfect sense. And actually, Don has another question about a specific designer that I thought was interesting. Apparently, you're a big fan of Don Norman. I personally don't know who that is, and apparently, is a book called "Living with Complexity." Can you tell us what that's about for someone who really isn't familiar with industrial design?
So I'm gonna start before the book. I'm gonna talk about Don Norman because I missed Don Norman. He gave a lecture at the university, but I wasn't told about it until after he left. And
no.
And the same thing happened in Korea, where I arrived after he left as well.
Oh no.
Because I did a semester abroad in Korea. So I still want to meet him. I mean, he's like. He wrote a book. So Don Norman, he's a big figure in the design world, but I'm not sure if he's exactly a designer. I think he is a cognitive psychologist, or at least he talks about cognitive ergonomics.
Okay.
So where when I talked about the can opener, I talked a lot about the kind of physical ergonomics. So how does it fit in your hand? How can you apply force to it? Cognitive ergonomics is much more about having products that are understandable.
Okay.
Right. And so Don Norman wrote a like, I don't want to say revolutionary, I don't want to say groundbreaking, but like a very important book in the world of design called The Design of Everyday Things. And The Design of Everyday Things is one of my favorite types of books, which is it lays out a very simple premise, which is try to design things in an understandable way. And then it has kind of subsections, but then it just keeps reiterating on that with different points, or with different examples, with different facets of how to make things understandable. And he talks about something that's called affordances, which is very important in physical design. And that's kind of so it's like giving things shape or some kind of difference so that it hints at how they're used. So one big example is like, say you're designing some kind of physical interface. So with switches and knobs and sliders, right?
Okay.
A circular knob affords somebody twisting it because you can grab onto a knob and twist it.
Yeah.
Right. If it was a square, it would be pretty weird to twist, but you could still do it, but it would be strange.
Yeah.
If it was a circle that you had to push as a slider, it would be really uncomfortable because you're pushing on the edge of a circle. So the physical shape of something allows people to use it in a certain way, and thus it is an affordance, right? So a circle affords twisting. A string affords pulling, but doesn't afford pushing.
That makes sense.
And you can also think about this in like a physical context, right? So if you have an entirely like if you have an iPad that's off, it doesn't afford anything. The user has no clues on how to use it. But if you turn on the iPad and you see these big square icons, suddenly it's like a cognitive affordance. You can understand, oh, these have some meaning. Then he wrote another book, which I think, I mean, I'm sure he's written quite a few books. But the book that I think I talked to Don, not Don Norman, but the aforementioned Don about is Living with Complexity. And I have to admit, my memory is a little hazy because I've reread Design of Everyday Things a few times, and Living with Complexity, I think I only read once. But the central thesis, or the attempt of Living with Complexity, is figuring out how to map complex cognitive systems simply. So where I have a pretty good metaphor for this. So Don Norman, there's a thing called Norman doors. So these are doors where the handles are wrong. So if you ever walk up to a door with a doorknob, but it's a push door, it's kind of a weird experience, right? Because you turn the doorknob and then you want to pull because a doorknob affords pulling because you can pull on it, but it's a push door. So you stand there for a moment and you kind of slam the door against the frame, and then you realize, oh, I'm supposed to push. And then you push. And these doors with just like a bar are the worst because you can pull on a bar and you can push on a bar, and usually they have bars on both sides, so you're not sure what you're supposed to do. So a door with the wrong type of handle, one that you want to pull but you should push the door, one that you want to push but you should pull the door, that's called a Norman door, because I guess Don Norman noticed it, and now everybody's teasing him by saying, you're the guy who thinks about this, so that's your door now.
Nice.
So where Design of Everyday Things talks about Norman doors, Living with Complexity talks more about things like setting the time on a microwave. Or I think there's an example in the book where he talks about programming a piano, like a Casio keyboard piano, where they try to abstract complex interfaces with a few buttons, but they do it by basically putting everything in menus, right? So if you want to program the time on the microwave, right, you see where the time is, and it would be great if we lived in an older era where instead of the little electronic segments, you just had like a clock, and then you can just turn the little knob next to the clock and it's just setting a clock. But instead what they do, right, you have to like press the program mode, or in some microwaves, you have to press two buttons at the same time and then wait until it beeps and then you can put in the time, right? Like there's no simple cognitive approach to doing that. So in Living with Complexity, he tries to highlight kind of this weird thing where somehow, even with interfaces and buttons and stuff, we've made things more complex, because instead of adapting the interface to somebody's mind, to somebody's cognitive model, we just say, oh, great, we've got buttons, so we can just have menus, and the menus can have submenus, and the submenus can have sub-submenus. So suddenly changing the time becomes pushing various buttons for God knows what reason, and then you're changing the time. So he suggests other ways of approaching that. But I think Living with Complexity is a bit less appreciated than the Design of Everyday Things, because that's like the magnum opus of at least kind of more physical design. Because I'm not sure if you want to get into it, but the like what is industrial design is a fascinating question. So if I can rant for a few
go
moments.
for it. Go for it.
Okay, so design is a really new field, right? Like engineering has been around for a long time. I mean, I don't know if somebody chopping down a log and throwing it over a river counts as building a bridge. That's a question one of my engineering teachers used to give me. Like, when does putting a log over a river become engineering versus just doing an activity? But at some point we started building bridges. We started making catapults, like, way before any of us were born. But there's people who were born and around now who were born before industrial design as a field existed. Not very many, but a few. And I think, of course, there's like various people who are proto designers, people who were thinking about how people would use things. But design really came about like with products, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, there was no industrial design as a field because
there were no products. There were consumer products, at least,
Yeah. So once replaceable parts came, like then you're seeing all these machines that are in need of design, right? Like all the factories where people are getting their fingers chopped off, a lot of decisions where they're like, we need to make this work, and then we'll put people in the area, or we need to right. You don't see a lot of thinking about how people can interact with something and then changing it based on that. Now that I say it, I'm sure there were some people doing it, but as a field, industrial design only kind of started happening when there were like plastics, right?
Okay.
Like the industrial design faculty in Delft is, I think, 80 years old. And I think a lot of design as a serious art form started taking place in kind of the 30s, 40s, 50s, right? Like before then, you didn't really have as much design, and you didn't have design as a school. You didn't have design as like theory and research and everything. And design, modern industrial design, which is, I'm just going to label this, mostly started in what we call in Europe form giving. And in the US, I haven't really found a good term for this, but it's very aesthetic industrial design. So the classic example of this is like TV design, right? In the 70s, they made a TV, they made the tubes, they made all the systems, and then they said, hey, we need to sell this, so the outside needs to look good. And they would go to somebody and say, make the outside of this TV look good. And they would go, great, so we're going to have one model with the same innards that's going to be in a wooden cabinet, one that's going to have like a red plastic cabinet, it's going to look fast, one that looks futuristic, yada, yada, yada. So you have this very kind of not simple, but very aesthetically focused design. And they call it form giving, which feels like one of these beautiful German, like we took form and giving and shoved it together. It's a word. You have this very form giving, because you have systems, mechanical things that need to be, not exposed. So you give it an outside shape. And then that kind of shifted. So then it started going from like, okay, make the aesthetics nice to make the user interface a bit nice, right? Like try to think of how somebody turns the knobs on the TV. Try to make this can opener a better can opener. And then you have design, like now we have design in a lot of different fields. So we have strategic design, service design, UX, UI design, product design, which is mostly what I do. So you have like a lot more branches that focus on different things. So I think Don Norman's book is super important for like physical design, and there's lessons you can take to like UI, UX, and maybe a bit service design, but you see a lot of fragmentation of what design is. And it's all, I hope it's all with the core belief of like keeping the user focus. But you see like design thinking is a big thing, and a lot of companies do design sprints where they take Post-it notes and put it up on the wall, and then they're like, oh, we're designing something. And it's like, I mean, as long as they're keeping the user focus, I would say yes, but you can also use design tools, which is putting Post-it notes up everywhere, right? Like we've developed strategies for brainstorming and thinking of things with each other and coming up with ideas, and you can apply that to other areas. But it's a little fluid what is and isn't design, and it doesn't really matter, but it's a discussion you have with a lot of designers. So
Sure, and I'm sure that every designer has their own definition.
yeah,
Just like art.
Exactly. There's as many definitions as there are designers. And then, of course, there's people who one person wouldn't consider a designer, but they consider themselves a designer, so they get to have their own opinion. I mean, it's fun, right? But it's a relatively young field with all these different branches and all this attention from things like Apple and I don't know, service design is big in some, like design thinking is a big buzzword in some areas. I'm sure in like the meat packing industry, it probably hasn't taken on, but I know in a lot of like tech.
Yeah, UX, UI are used all the time. User experience, user interface.
Yeah, I mean it's a little disheartening for me, or rather, it's like I love it. I love that there's more attention to design, but it does make finding something like a job a bit more difficult as a physical designer. Just because of the sheer volume of things that say design on it, and like a lot of that gets you see something like a post for product designer, and it's like, oh, wonderful, I'm a product designer, and then they're like, oh, our product is an app, and you'll be designing it, and it's like,
yeah, so it's not,
but that's
not necessarily.
Me. Yeah.
Well, so I do wish you good luck on the job hunt. But I actually am curious. This is Don's question as well. Is there like an object that you feel embodies your design philosophy, or at least good design in your opinion?
I mean, I think the OXO Good Grips example from before, personally, that reflects a lot of this kind of design as an improvement of an existing product. I think for me, that's the main example.
Or how about this? This is another question. Is there a design that really grinds your gears that you absolutely hate? Maybe the Asus computer.
Oh, I mean, yeah. So I love consumer electronics, but there's definitely it's gotten way better. Like I think we can all agree that laptops, especially Windows laptops, have improved tremendously. But I think that's still one of my one of the things that irritates me, and I think I don't think it's the designer's fault necessarily. I feel like it's one of those things where they're making a very clear balance between like how much money we're going to put into the design and how much money we're going to put into the components, and then like that's it. And I think in like Apple's case, they have a lot of money for both, so they're just pumping it out there. But I feel like somehow working with more designers has given me more empathy. So even if I get a bit annoyed, I'm like, I can see what people are trying. Yeah. I mean, there's some. And
I'd imagine, and like you alluded to, I'd imagine sometimes it's not even the designer's fault. Like you said, there could be a designer's working as a company, and there's cost constraints, there's engineering constraints. So it might not be like this is what the designer wanted, but this is just what was possible given all the different parties involved in making the product.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that alludes to a big question that I always have, which is, what is the role of a designer? Because you have designers that, and I've talked to a bunch of people who graduated from my school, and they do vastly different things. There's some people who are very like, I have a friend who's a car designer, and car designers are like a special breed of designers. They're like the horse girls of the design world, because if you look at their notes, it's all just sketches of cars, right? You're sitting in a lecture about, I don't know, like about ergonomics. So the ladies, like the lecturer is talking like, all right, so you have a curve of the height of everybody, whatever. And then you look over and he's just sketching cars, just constantly cars, never the interior, never details, just the car.
The car.
And so you have people that do that. And then you have, so I worked for a year before I started my PhD. And that was a much smaller team. And we were a few designers, and you were less responsible for only aesthetics. You were really like the integrator, right? Like it was my job to talk to electrical engineers and see like, hey, what are your requirements? What are your restrictions? What can you give? Then talk to the people in charge of the budget, see what we were flexible with, then kind of take a step back and say, okay, what are the most valuable things to the user? How can we balance this out? So you also have, I'm not sure if that's design or something else, but you have designers acting as these kind of middlemen a little bit.
Yeah, well, I feel like that's realistic design, right? Because you have to take into account the constraints.
Yeah.
I feel like some companies probably give their designer. It depends on the company. Like I'm sure Apple probably values their design team maybe more than some other companies.
Yeah, and
design input.
yeah, exactly. And it's of course like, there's no one right solution or one company would just like.
Sure.
That's the beautiful thing about product design or design and development of any kind, right? Is there is challenge. If it was I thought this as a kid at one moment. I was like, why are there architects? Because shouldn't we have solved buildings? Which is a very naive and kind of like utilitarian thought. Like, shouldn't we just know, okay, you put in a cube, you put this part of the cube for the bathroom, and then you're done. Like, right, you know exactly the optimal design for people. And of course that's not at all the case, but that gives it fun and energy. If it was just pushing the same button over and over, then yeah, we could just let a computer take care of it. And there are people working on generative design, but it's kind of hilarious because design is so much about talking to people, like actually, or at least for me, for the type of design I engage in, actually doing the design is very little. It's about like figuring out the integration, talking with other people. It's also because I have a technical background, so I tend to kind of merge this line between engineering and design.
Yeah.
But like doing the sketching, making the thing, that's very little of what I actually do. It's about communication, balancing, talking to users, like figuring out what people actually want, because you can generate a beautiful looking, I don't know, whatever, say they're generating cars. That's great. You can design a really cool looking car. You can design a really practical looking car, but you need to know what people actually want in a car. You're not going to be able to do that by just generating car. I guess you could just generate cars, make them, and see if people buy them, but it's not the most efficient way.
I'd imagine there is some iterative process though. Like if we're in version 3 of a product and then you hear the feedback, you can take into account those reviews into the 4th version of the product, for instance.
Yeah, so that's a thought that I've been having lately, because there's definitely like we call it redesign, right? So revisions or making a new product, but kind of in line with the previous products that you've made. And then there's also new product development. So NPD, that's a phrase some people use. And I'm not entirely sure if that actually exists. And like a very, like a very abstract level, right? I'm not sure if as a designer, I'm capable of thinking of an entirely new product. It's always going to have something. And I mean, I think it's like when you read into kind of people writing about aliens, as I do, because I'm a strange person. But there's certain kind of constants, right? Like you know, because of gravity that people aren't going to be 700 feet tall. Because of biology, right? Like you have, there's like a limit to the size of spiders because spiders breathe through their skin, so they can't have more volume than they have surface area to breathe through. So if you're designing,
know that, but
yeah, I mean, it's like the clear, it's just the clearest example of these like natural laws that you can't break in biology. So if you're designing a wheelchair for spiders, I don't know why you would, but you know the sizes you're dealing with because there's a hard limit, right? There's only so much oxygen a spider could absorb.
Yeah.
So I think like that in design, you have these constraints. You know you're dealing with people. So you already take so much knowledge into a new product design. I think you're always redesigning a bit, which is really comforting, because if you were designing an entirely new product, you wouldn't know what to do. Like if I was designing, like I can't even name a completely new product, but if I was designing something for aliens that lets them do something that I don't even know what they're doing, I don't know where to start, because I don't have any frame of reference. So I think redesign when you really know the same product is useful, but I think all new product development, you at least know people, and hopefully in your team you have some knowledge about the product, right?
Yeah, even if you're building like a new laptop version, you still know how laptops work in general.
Yeah,
So,
or if you suddenly get $15 billion and you're like, I'm going to make a company that makes laptops, I hope you wouldn't go, okay, so we're going to hire a guy who designs bicycles. We're going to hire a guy who lays bricks and builds it. Like, you would hopefully pick somebody that at least knows, like, I mean, even in bicycles now with e-bikes, people know about consumer electronics to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
So you at least bring in some skills that are adjacent to what you're trying to do, which is comforting to me. But I think that you're always redesigning in some sense, even if it's just the thought you had in your mind. I think that's a big thing. And design is entirely iterative. Like, that's the biggest thing in design. I don't know why I didn't mention that before. The biggest thing. It's an iterative process because you're never going to get it right the first time. So you talk to people, you come up with ideas, you try to kind of like balance the ideas, right? So you say, okay, we're going to make a can opener that's lasers. Okay, we can't afford that. So then you kind of make compromises, you come up with a product, and then you test it somehow. And I think the thing I'm a little bit jealous about for UX UI designers is that testing is so cheap for them.
Yeah, it's because it's a technology service. It's not like a physical product you need to make.
Yeah, exactly. Like, okay, it's expensive to hire developers, but UI UX, you can design, you can make a prototype. You can, like, just through Framer or Figma or whatever, you can make a prototype of an app that at least tests the thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
But if you want to test how do people put stuff into a coffee machine, you still have to build like a mock-up of the coffee machine, right? Like, it requires so much more effort, and it is a little annoying that they just get to test so much faster. But it's cool. You can take lessons from them, right? You can figure out how to improve your own test setup to pull more data from your test setups. It's so it's iterative in so many ways. You come up with concepts, you put them somewhere, you look at them 5 days later, you realize, okay, these are the things I hate, and then you kind of redesign. So it's cycles upon cycles.
Nice.
And there's a lot of visual. So one thing I love about design, especially as an academic field, is there's so many graphics. Like, papers in the industrial design field tend to have figures, so graphics, images that kind of try to explain the stuff that's already in the text, which is beautiful because I'm a visual learner. So for me, having an image is so much nicer. But you end up with a lot of like things that normal scientists hate, where you have graphs without labels, right? You have a graph that's like innovation goes up, uncertainty goes down. And as an industrial designer, you're like, yeah, sure, of course, because or actually that wouldn't happen, but like cycles go up, like work on the product goes up, uncertainty goes down. And you're like, of course, because you're uncovering more things, you're more sure of what you want to do. Cool. But if you try to show that to like a chemist, they're like, I don't know what this is. Like, what is your measure of uncertainty? I don't understand. And I love that about design. So I think if you ever want, you can Google design cycle and you'll come up with like 7 different graphs of like various things. Usually they start off with like a lot of squiggles, and then they start to like slowly get down to a line, and then they're like, okay, you're done. And it's beautiful because that does describe the process, but it really doesn't say anything about it. Like, you can't be like, I'm in this part of the squiggles, but when you're going through it, you're like, okay, I'm still in the squiggly part. I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm coming closer to an idea.
Nice. We've talked at least an hour about industrial design, which is awesome. I'm not sure if we'll have time to do improv comedy, though I'm down to definitely have you on another podcast to talk about that. But I was wondering if there's anything else about industrial design that you wanted to talk about that we haven't quite covered, or that you wanted to Yeah, just that you wanted to share, basically.
I mean, I feel like I've gotten a chance to get out a lot of disparate thoughts. I feel like I've wandered from the questions.
No, that's
Um,
okay. The tangents make it fun.
Good. I'm glad because otherwise I would be feeling very guilty for all the editing you're going to try to do
Oh
to make
no, no, no
it
editing.
on
I don't
time.
think there's any editing necessary so far. It's all good stuff.
Yeah. What do I want? I mean, I think the biggest takeaway message that I would want people to gather from this is um, to try to, like, if you're developing something, if you're making something, try to engage with your users. I
Mm.
think a lot of people have realized that this is important, but I know a lot of people who work in various positions and don't really care about the person using the product. And I think you learn a lot from doing it, and it's difficult, especially if you want to like interview people. But just try to make sure somewhere in your mind that there's a user somewhere present in your mind. I think that that gives you an interesting perspective, especially if you're in a very technical field. Um, and of course, I would love if everybody read The Design of Everyday Things. I think it's the design of everyday things. So they talk a lot about like, I mean, we're living in a appified touchscreen world. I think I kind of regret not being born into a point in time where I could be a designer in like the 80s, where everything needed switches and buttons and like panels, right? Because now a lot of things can just be an app on your phone. I mean, there's a joke somewhere on Reddit where they draw like a Walkman and a like a old cell phone and like a ruler and a calculator. They draw like all these things, and then it's like, oh, this is what you needed in 19 whatever, and then they draw a cell phone, and they're like, it's all in there now. I think it does make life a little bit more boring in some respects. It makes it exciting in other things, but
Mhm.
the design of everyday things talks about everyday things from a design perspective. I think it's wonderful. And I think that's, yeah, the biggest lesson is have empathy for each other. Think about your user, and hopefully somebody's thinking about you as a user as well, and you can just take care of each other.
No, that's a great lesson. I think that's a good thought to end at. But yeah, thank you so much, Woe, for coming on. I feel like I learned a lot. I actually, believe it or not, think about shoe design a lot because I have pretty bad feet and pretty flat feet, and so I'm always looking for like shoe design to accommodate that. And like, it's interesting. Like if you've done enough deep diving, like I have, the different technologies that they use in shoes, like the supports, the heel drops, the sizing. It's actually pretty fascinating. So I wasn't really thinking in industrial design terms, but at least officially, but indirectly, that is something I think about a lot is the design of shoes.
Yeah, I have a friend who's like a shoe design guy. So he loves like sketching the shoes. But he works with, it's a really big thing in the last few years, and I'm not sure if I really believe in it as much as some people, but 3D printing shoes is a big thing.
Interesting.
Um, and as somebody who's blessed with like normal shoes, I'm gonna reveal a little dorky thing some people say, which is like as P90. So you have percentiles and ergonomics. So you have like P100 means 100% of the population. P95 is 95%, and P90 is like most people except for the edge cases. So as somebody with like, you know, I guess fine feet, I don't have any problem with shoes. For me, like 3D printing shoes, I don't really understand, but I feel like that solves the technology behind implementing all of these technologies for fitting with people who have difficulty with shoes feet. So I think it's a beautiful example of like getting designers to figure out what people need, and
Mm,
then getting technology to a point where you can kind of merge it together and really produce a product.
no, for sure. But yeah, thank you so much, and hopefully get you again, and we can talk about improv comedy.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. Thanks for letting me rant, and I hope people enjoy this
Oh,
episode.
I think they definitely will. But yeah, thank you again.
Excellent. Yeah, no problem.